Hey YouTube, Doug with D&E in the garage here. I'm inside today because I want to do something different than a walkthrough video. I've got some things to say. Alright, if you can't tell from my shirt and my mug and from all of my videos, I am a Jeep enthusiast. I love Jeep. I love the Jeep brand. I'm loyal to the Jeep brand. I've been working on Jeeps for a long time. I've been driving Jeeps for a long time. I've learned a ton about Jeeps through my experiences. And one of the things, or a few of the things that I've learned to put up with, are the crazy misinformed opinions that people seem to have about Jeep. When you tell somebody that I drive a Jeep, or I like the Jeep brand, or I only buy Jeeps, they give you the craziest responses, and the things you hear people say, the opinions that people have of Jeeps are just, you wonder, like, where did you possibly get an opinion like that, And what I want to do today is kind of try to explain the reasons that I love Jeep, and also to debunk some of the crazier, like, I don't even know if I want to call them myths or just misinformation there is about Jeeps. The first thing that when you tell somebody you drive Jeeps, almost always, the very first thing you hear is, Jeeps aren't very efficient. And to that I say, okay, who asked you? And also, at what point did I say that that's what I was going for? I know that I get bad gas mileage in my Jeep. I'm aware of that. I've been driving them for a long time. I've also driven Subarus, and I've driven other vehicles that do get better gas mileage, so I'm fully aware that the mileage I'm getting now is not what you consider good. But thank you for telling me. I'd like to add that I wasn't really looking for a good gas mileage vehicle. You telling me that my vehicle doesn't get good gas mileage is like me telling you that your Prius is bad off-road. It's not what it's meant to do. You didn't buy it to go off-road. You don't care that it's not good off-road, which is exactly how I feel about the fact that my Jeep and most other Jeeps, not modern Jeeps, they're pretty good, but, things with the 4.0 and before that, they don't get great gas mileage, and that's fine with me. But people love to bring that up as though it's going to be a surprise to me, or as though it's like I'm embarrassed of the fact that I don't get good gas mileage. I don't care, alright? Stop telling me. The next thing is a complex issue, right? You hear the next one from parents a lot. They'll say stuff to you like, Jeeps are pretty unsafe. They roll over. I wouldn't let my kid drive a Jeep. And I've actually got a mug right here kind of dedicated to that idea. It's a little "That's How I Roll" mug. Delicious. This is a complex issue, and it's kind of misinformation and it's kind of not. I'm going to start with the easiest thing. Alright, I don't know a statistic for this, but I am willing to bet that Jeeps probably do roll over more than other brands. Now, why is that? Because more than any other brand, Jeeps get modified and lifted to a position and put into a situation where, rolling over is more likely, alright? If people started lifting CRVs the way that people lift Jeeps, I'll bet you'd start hearing that CRVs roll over a lot, when you take a Wrangler and you lift it 8 inches and put 35s on it on the stock rims, and then you drive at 95 miles an hour on a freeway, yeah, it flips over and people get hurt, and people get a bad impression of Jeep. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that to your Jeep, I'm just saying it's not like surprising that Jeeps get that Jeeps have this reputation for flipping over, or that they do flip over. It's kind of like saying, well, people who drive SRT Hellcat probably get a lot of tickets. Yeah, of course they do, because that's what that car is meant to do. It's meant to go fast, and it doesn't do anything else. All right, it's obvious, why they get tickets. It's not like it's something wrong with the car. It's kind of on the driver at that point. If you lift your vehicle like crazy and don't drive responsibly enough, based on the fact that you now have a lifted modified vehicle, yeah, you might flip. The next piece of this is actually some misinformation from the 80s, right? In 1980, the IIHS went on 60 Minutes, and they did a whole segment on highway rollovers. And the whole purpose, it was obviously a noble purpose. They were trying to enact change and educate people about how dangerous highway rollovers can be. And to depict highway rollovers, they picked the CJ5 as the vehicle they were going to use in the special. And this special showed numerous CJ5s rolling over in horrific crashes. And it gave the CJ5 and Jeep a really bad name, and it kind of helped start this thing that people have now with Jeeps rolling over. What we didn't know at the time that we know now is that for the IIHS to get the footage of these numerous CJs flipping in these horrific high-speed rollover crashes, they'd actually stacked weights on the inside fender of CJ5s to make them roll. Not only that, not only were they obviously putting it in the optimum position to roll and stacking weights on one side to help it roll, they had to do 435 takes to get the 8 successful rollovers they needed for the footage. 8 out of 435. I'm not great at math on the spot, but I think that's less than 2%. And that's in optimum conditions with weights stacked. So I understand what the IHS was trying to do. They were trying to educate people, and maybe they thought this was a good vehicle to demonstrate with, but it really did a number on Jeep's reputation, and that kind of still sticks around to today. Another thing, the last thing that I believe adds to this misinformation or this opinion that Jeeps are rollover happy is a vehicle that doesn't even have anything to do with Jeep. It's called the Ford M151. Let me explain real quick. The first Jeeps were the MBs. They had those during World War II. Right after World War II, Willys Overland revamped the Jeep into the M38 for military use. After the M38, Ford stepped in and they revamped and they did the next generation of military light reconnaissance vehicles. And that was the M151. And what they did with the M151 is they tried to solve some of the problems that the earlier Jeeps had that the military didn't like so much. And one thing they added was an independent front suspension, whereas all previous Jeeps had solid front axles. Independent front suspension has benefits. One of the problems with it is this, right? Picture a solid front axle first. If you go over a jump or like a dune or something where your front tires are going to get air, they're going to come off the ground, your tires are going to leave the ground, your body's going to lift up, but when you land, the body's going to land parallel with the axle, and they're all going to land like this, because you can't, the axle doesn't really, I mean, it does articulate, but when you land with a solid front axle, everything lands together. Now, when you lift up a vehicle with independent front suspension, what happens to the wheels? Do they go straight down like a solid axle will? They don't. They actually tuck in because of the way the control arms are. And if you land that vehicle that now has slightly tucked in wheels at an angle, it has a potential to snap and the whole control arm assembly to just sort of fold under the Jeep. And that's what happened alarmingly often with the 151. To compound this issue, that was a very light vehicle, so it rolled easily, and it had no roll cage. It was just open top, like most military Jeeps of the day. So people got really hurt when this happened. I can hear you saying, well, what does this have to do with Jeep? That was a Ford vehicle. Here's the problem. After World War II, the Jeep made such an impression that all vehicles that looked like that were Jeeps. They didn't have models, they didn't have names, they didn't have manufacturers, they were just Jeeps. So when Ford introduced this M151 that looked very similar to other Jeeps, it was just a Jeep. The GIs who drove it were Jeeps, civilians who saw it were Jeeps, called it Jeeps. It's just what it was a Jeep. So when you heard that this new Jeep had a potential to roll over, it actually had a bunch of handling issues, to the point where the military had a whole campaign of awareness, and it was like, I think it was like a poster with a blindfolded soldier kind of like with his hand on the tire of a 151, and the caption was, "Take some time to get to know your wheels," or something. And the whole idea was, hey, this new independent suspension vehicle handles way different than your old Jeeps. You're gonna friggin' kill yourself if you are not aware of that. And that kind of that negative press didn't fall on Ford, it fell on the Jeep name, which kind of carried through to today. And I think all of those factors, people modifying their vehicles and making them more prone to rollover than a stock vehicle would, the IIHS 60 Minutes special, and this Ford M151 having huge handling issues, I think that all led to people having an opinion today that Jeeps roll over a lot. And I don't think it's true. I've driven plenty of stock Jeeps, Wranglers, Grand Cherokees, and they don't feel any different than anything else, any other vehicle of similar size and weight. I've had lifted vehicles. I had a lifted XJ on 33s, 5 inches lift, and that thing absolutely, like, if you could feel it wanting to, get up on 2 wheels, and so I had to be aware of that. That's all there is to it. The next thing that people love to say whenever you tell them that you are into Jeeps, let me dig into this a little further, right? People know that I love Jeeps. They also know that I'm a patriot. You know what I mean? I love this flag right here, and I love this country. And I'm not about to get political on you, but I do, all right? And I love our history. So when people ask me why I love Jeeps, I have no problem telling them I believe it's the most American brand. You heard me right. And before you all pull away, especially you Ford, GM, Dodge guys, I'm not taking anything away from your brand. Stick with me here. I got a lot to say on this topic. I believe that Jeep is the most American brand. Now, when you tell somebody that, their little minds explode, all right? They instantly start babbling off about, don't you know that Jeeps aren't even made in the United States anymore? And I think Jeep's even owned by an Italian company now. And in fact, BMWs and Toyotas are made in Georgia, so are BMWs and Toyotas more American than Jeep? And at that point, my mind explodes, because these people are missing the point. They don't get Jeep at all. And that's fine, I guess. And you know what? I don't have time usually to sit there with everybody who says some ignorant garbage like this to me to try to explain to them what I'm about to explain to you. But lucky for you, I have the time right now. So I am going to take the time to explain why I believe and can back up that Jeep is the most American brand ever. Hands down. Alrighty, for me to properly explain to you and back up that opinion that I just shared, I need for you to understand the history of Jeep and the inception of Jeep. And for you to properly understand that, I need to take you back just a little bit further to the turn of the century, the last century, 1900. Alright, in 1900, militaries were still using horses for quite a lot of stuff. They were using them for reconnaissance. They were using them as command. The cavalry still existed. In fact, up to World War I, the cavalry. Now, when I say cavalry, think Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders cavalry. You know, guys mounted on horses. They used it right up to World War I. In fact, in World War I, there were cavalry units on the same battlefield with tanks and submachine guns. Modern mechanized warfare right next to these horse-mounted soldiers, and the casualties were immense. And after World War I, it became obvious to everyone that the horse, as a military weapon, as an integral part of war, was no more. All right, the time had passed, and with this new modern warfare, we needed to modernize our way that we moved individual people, that we conducted reconnaissance, and we needed to do it without the horse. Now, during World War I, we did use vehicles like the Model T and the Mack were both used extensively. And let me give a quick side note. This has nothing to do with anything, but I think it's a really interesting story. We sent a bunch of Mack trucks over in the beginning of World War I to our allies over there, and they noticed not only how odd early Macks looked, kind of like scrunched up in the front, but also how tenacious and capable they were. And so the British soldiers gave the Mack truck an interesting nickname. They called it the Bulldog. And that nickname actually withstands to this very day as Mack's logo. Mack's logo, that bulldog that sits on their hood, that was given to them by British soldiers in the beginning of World War I. I just think that's an interesting story. It has nothing to do with why Jeep is the most American brand. So after the war, we're looking at the vehicles we used during World War I, and they were great, really capable, like I just said, but they were two-wheel drive. They were great as long as they were on roads, but what if you had to cross where a tank had just gone through the mud, all right? A Mack and a Model T and any other two-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive vehicle isn't going to cut it. So the government started looking for a solution to this. They needed a four-wheel drive vehicle, which was a new technology at the time. Four-wheel drive was just beginning to come around. And they kind of floundered with the idea all through the late teens and the 1920s into the 1930s. And then World War II breaks out. Hitler starts moving across Poland, and it becomes very obvious that the entire globe is again going to be embroiled in a global conflict. And we want to be prepared. So the U.S. government, the U.S. Army, puts out a bid to 135 automakers, domestic automakers like Ford and Chevy and Chrysler and pretty much every American automaker that was active at the time. And they put out this criteria, and they want everybody to come up with, or they want somebody to come up with, this four-wheel drive vehicle. And they specify what the wheelbase has to be, and the track has to be, and the ground clearance. They also specify it must be 50 horsepower, it must be four-wheel drive, it must hold 4 men, and it must be no more than 1,200 pounds, which is a pretty insane specification, but the military wanted this vehicle to be able to be picked up by 4 guys and maneuvered if it was stuck in a rut or in a ditch or something. This ended up getting changed later, and what they went with was more heavy, but that's not even the most difficult specification that they laid down. The most difficult one was that they wanted a working prototype in their hands in 49 days. What is that, like 7 weeks? 49 days to design, build, and get to the government a working model of this four-wheel drive vehicle. Think of four-wheel drive at this time the way we are looking at electric cars today. All right, it's a very new technology. There are a few people that are doing it. Some people are doing it well, some people are not, but all in all, it's not something that you just slap together. The technology just isn't at that level. So this last criteria, this crazy truncated production time, scares away everybody except for 2 companies. The first one is Willys Overland. Let me take another side road here. I'm sure most of you have heard of Willys Overland. A fun fact, or an interesting fact, is that Willys was founded by a German guy, and his name wasn't Willys, it was Willis. Everybody says it wrong. I don't know if it's just us Americanizing his name, but in fact Willys Overland was Willis Overland. I think Willys sounds better than Willis, so I'm going to say Willys, but just know that we're all saying it wrong. Willys Overland answers this bid, but they say we can't do it in the time, so give us more time or what. I mean, we're really interested, but we just can't do it. The only other company to answer was a small company from Butler, Pennsylvania called the American Bantam Car Company. What you need to know about Bantam Car at the time of this bid was that they were going out of business. They were in financial ruin. They had 15 employees, and none of them were engineers. And what these men knew is that this bid, this potential government contract to build this vehicle, was the only thing they had that could save their company. So they went out and they found an engineer by the name of Carl Probst, and they convinced him to work almost for free. He only was going to get paid if the government took his design, and they presented him with the requirements and the time frame, and they sent him to work, and he designed a vehicle that met the specifications in 5 days, basically over a weekend if you think about it. They took these plans and they sent them off to the government, and the government looked at them and they said, yeah, I think this will work. Why don't you go and build the darn thing? The clock's ticking on those 49 days. Get us a vehicle. And miraculously they do it. All right. Now, to build this vehicle, which they had dubbed the reconnaissance car, or nicknamed the Bantam Blitz buggy. To build this thing, considering the lack of resources and money and time, they were borrowing and stealing components, all right? They were in their own parts bins, taking stuff off cars. They had to go to other car companies to try to get pieces. They went to Studebaker to get some Spicer axles to try to hobble together a four-wheel drive system. They went to junkyards, all right? The hood for the Bantam Blitz buggy was actually the trunk lid from another car they'd found in a junkyard. But somehow they do it. All right, they meet the 49-day deadline. They get their car off to the government. They actually had to drive They had to drive this vehicle they just built the 200 miles from Butler, Pennsylvania to Maryland, where it was going to be tested, and it did fine. They get it there, and the government is going over Bantam's product, and they love everything about what Bantam turned in except one thing. Bantam. They have serious concerns that Bantam does not have the manufacturing capacity to produce the vehicles they're going to need if they award them the bid. And honestly, they're probably right. They had 15 employees. They were basically going bankrupt. So they ask Bantam, they say, hey, this looks pretty good. Why don't you go make us a few more so we can properly test them? And in the meantime, they take those blueprints for Bantam's reconnaissance car, and they send them to 2 other companies. They send them to Willys Overland, who was so interested in this project in the first place, and they sent them to Ford Motor Company. And the reason they sent them to Ford was they were the largest car company in the United States, And Henry Ford was the manufacturing guru. He was the guy for manufacturing at this time. Over the course of the war, I'm sure you all know this, Ford made tanks, they made planes, they made everything you could imagine. Ford had designed and perfected the assembly line. So the government knew that if they actually had to build this thing and put it into production, they needed Ford involved. So they asked Ford and Willys to please take the plans and make their own version based on the plans that they had already approved from Bantam. Both companies produce a prototype. Willys is called the Quad, the Willys Quad, and Ford produces the Willys Pygmy. Both of them look almost identical to the Bantam buggy because they were based on the same plans. And they build several of each of these prototypes, and they send all 3 prototypes out into the field for soldiers to test in the jungle and in the snow and in the mud and in every condition possible. They take the Bantam Blitz buggy out there, the Willys Quad, and the Ford Pygmy. And over this time, each vehicle kind of changes a little bit. They make some revisions, they take some from each other. The Willys Quad actually moves on to a next generation known as the Willys MA, and then finally the next generation known as the Willys MB. And after extensive testing, it comes out that of the 3 cars, the one that the soldiers and the brass like the most is the Willys MB. It's the later version of the Quad, and they like it for 2 reasons. The first reason is that it's easy to work on. What the soldiers have found, that's the same reason that people love Jeep today, by the way. They're easy to work on. But that's another story. It's a whole nother rant. The reason that soldiers like the Willys MB is that if you have 2 wrecked Willys MBs, they got shot up, they got blown up, they got flipped. If you have 2 of them in the field, they found that quickly and easily, with rudimentary tools, they can take those 2 wrecked MBs and make one working vehicle. And they can't really say that about the Ford or the Bantam vehicle. Another thing, and probably more important than that, was the drivetrain. Let me explain what the engines were like in these vehicles. Now, Bantam, being in the position they were in, didn't manufacture their own engine for this project. They took an off-the-shelf crate motor from the Continental Motor Company. It was a good motor. There wasn't anything wrong with it. It might have been a little underpowered. It was just sort of there. Now, what Ford had done was they took one of their tried and tested and known to be successful tractor motors and put it in the Ford Pygmy. The problem with that is this: if you know anything about tractors, you know they operate low and slow. They low revs, low idle for a long period of time without much fluctuation or change, which is the exact opposite kind of operation than what you need in a military transport vehicle like, the Jeep, like the Pygmy. And the guys were in the field were finding that these vehicles were a little unreliable. They would break down a lot, and when they did, they were kind of hard to fix. Now, in contrast to those other 2 mediocre at best engines was the brand new, recently developed Willys straight 4-cylinder, 60 horsepower Go Devil engine. This thing was amazing. Not only did it have more horsepower and more torque than either of the other 2 engines, it was way more reliable. And the reason for that is that at this time, when Willys designed an engine, they had a requirement that before it could go to production, it had to run wide open for 100 hours. Can you even imagine that? They ran this thing for 100 hours before they sent it into production. So by the time it made its way into the Quad and the MA and the MB, they already knew that this motor was solid. And ultimately, the motor won Willys the contract. Bantam was awarded a lesser contract to produce the cargo trailers that Jeeps would pull. And I think they also built landing gears and maybe a few other things. And these contracts were enough to save their company. And there is no doubt in anyone's mind that Bantam would not have been awarded these contracts if it were not for the work they did on the Bantam buggy. If they didn't get this whole thing rolling, they would have been allowed to die, and by the time the war was over, they probably would have been out of business. Now, Ford was not down and out either. Because of their manufacturing prowess, they were asked to please produce Willys MBs in Ford factories. Willys MBs that were made in Ford factories would be known as GPWs. That distinction meant General Purpose Willys. These vehicles were known as General Purpose vehicles. A lot of people think that that is where the name Jeep comes from. GP, Jeep, you get it. So it was General Purpose was the type of vehicle it was. Willys was the original design. If it was made in a Ford factory, that's what it got. If it was made in a Willys factory, it was an MB. They were the same vehicle, basically. There were only very minor differences. I think the frames were slightly different. Another interesting thing is that Henry Ford insisted on every piece possible being stamped with the large cursive Ford F, you know, that emblematic F that everybody associates with Ford. So if you find a GPW, even though it is a Willys vehicle, it's their design, the bolt heads will be stamped with it, and the engine block and everything else that possibly could be. I guess that's just part of Henry Ford's ego. Another interesting thing to note about the two vehicles, the Ford Pygmy and the Willys MB, I told you that during the testing period, they were taking a lot from each other. And one of the things that got taken from the Ford Pygmy to the Willys MB was the grill that they used. Now, the original Willys quad grill was sort of rounded, and it had these vertical metal rods welded in. It was very strong, but it was more expensive to make, and it took longer than Ford's design, which was a flat, stamped steel design with vertical slats and 2 holes for the headlights. Now, if you are an astute Jeep enthusiast, you will realize that I've basically just described what is the symbol of our brand, all right? The Jeep grill with the 7 slats and the 2 holes and the 2 smaller holes. That design was actually designed by Ford. And during the testing and refining process, it got taken by Willys. The original Ford one had 9 slats, Willys had 7. We can thank the most important piece about our brand, we can thank Ford for that, you know, which I think is kind of interesting. So these vehicles go into production, and they basically win the war for us, you know. Eisenhower said that the Jeep is one of 3 things without which we never would have won the war, and that's a pretty big thing for a guy like Eisenhower to say. These things did everything that was asked of them, and they were beloved by the men that drove them. And then after the war, right, so now the war is over, and these guys are coming home, and we're not really sure where or when the term Jeep actually came into use. Some people thought it was from GPW or GPV, General Purpose Vehicle. Other people think it was from, there was actually a character in 1937 called Eugene the Jeep in Popeye commercials, and he was like this magical creature who could go anywhere and do anything. So some people think that GI started calling it a Jeep because it could go anywhere and do anything. But by the end of the war, the name Jeep is being used to describe these vehicles. So after the war, Ford goes back to doing what Ford does best, making cars and trucks. And Willys goes back to kind of being a mediocre car company. You know, can you name another Willys Overland product? You can't. So in 1938, the government asked Willys to revamp the MB and make some small changes to it, which they oblige, and they create the M38, which is the next generation of military Jeeps. And while they're creating it, they realize, hey, there might be a civilian market for this. So they go to the government, they ask to please have the patent rights, and ask to trademark the name Jeep, and of course the government doesn't care and allows them to. And the only company or entity that really could have argued with them was Ford, who could argue that they had some rights to the name Jeep and to the production and to the 7-slat grill, you know, which was basically theirs. But Jeep didn't think there was any market for this kind of vehicle on the civilian market, so they let it go, which I find very interesting. What they do is they take the M38 and they make minor changes for the civilian market, and they turn it into the CJ2A. CJ stands for Civilian Jeep, 2A is just the revision of it. And their idea is to market the CJ2A as an agricultural vehicle. They want to replace the tractor with the Jeep CJ2A. And so they make all these different attachments for the back of it. You can get a backhoe for a CJ2A. You can get plows and tillers and anything you could do with an agricultural tractor, they make sure you can do with a CJ2A. And while the vehicle did sell very well, Willys kind of bet the farm on it. And they were unsuccessful. They did not sell the numbers they expected to. They expected for every single farmer in the United States and beyond to own one of these things, and for tractors to stop being produced, and that's not really what happened. So with the brand failing a bit, because again, not that the vehicle didn't sell, but it didn't sell the numbers that they thought it would, and they kind of bet the farm on it. they sell the whole company, the whole Jeep name, to Kaiser Corporation, which quickly changes the name to Kaiser Jeep. And Kaiser has a much better idea. All right, Kaiser's idea for marketing Jeeps is to market them as a fun, rebellious vehicle for seeking out freedom. You know, they come out with models like the Wagoneer, which is the first SUV, and the Gladiator truck, which in my opinion is the most gorgeously constructed vehicle of all time. The lines on the hood and the grille of a Jeep Gladiator pickup truck, forget about it. And they very successfully take what is known as a military vehicle and what GIs love, and they market it to the civilian market, and they make Americans love Jeep. And they are credited with starting the Jeep craze. You know what I mean? And what this time period does is it starts the long tradition of Jeep being the best part of whatever brand or larger entity it is a part of. Name me another Kaiser product. You know, you can't. Jeep was the best part of it. Name me another Willys product. You can't. Jeep was the best part of it. Jeep is still doing that today. Fiat Chrysler America. You know, Jeep is what's keeping the lights on there. When AMC owned Jeep, sure, they were also selling other vehicles, but once they failed, once AMC was failing and their business partner Renault wanted to get out from underneath the burden of AMC, and they put them up for sale, who was interested in them? Lee Iacocca. Why was Lee Iacocca interested in the American Motor Company? It wasn't because he wanted to bring back the Pacer and the Javelin. That's illustrated by the fact that you can't buy a Pacer or Javelin today. What he wanted was the Jeep brand, because he knew that Jeep was just the thing to help him save the Chrysler Corporation, which was his task, his lot in life. He had already successfully revamped their image with the K-Car, you know, and he made them competitive with the Japanese market, but now he needed a vehicle to take them through into the beyond, and that was Jeep. In the 90s, Jeep is huge. Try to find a 90s movie that doesn't feature a Wrangler, a Cherokee, or a Grand Cherokee. You can't do it. I was just watching Goonies earlier today, and the first scene is an XJ like tearing through kind of off-road. A little bit ago I was watching Mrs. Doubtfire because that's what was on, and the main character is driving a Jeep. Alright, so what's the point? What does my original assertion that Jeep is the most American brand have anything to do with this long history lesson rant that I've just given? I said all of that to help explain the spirit that surrounded Jeep's creation, alright? And I believe that it is the exact same spirit that helped us create this country. Jeep was created by men who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Bantam was going to be out of business if they didn't pour their absolute 100% full selves into this project. And they succeeded. They may not have gotten the contract they were looking for, but they got another contract, and that saved their company. And that's the same spirit the founding fathers had when they founded and created this country. All right, if we didn't win the Revolutionary War, they were going to lose their lives. They were going to lose literally everything. And I think it's that same spirit that even today still surrounds Jeep. You know what I mean? Jeeps are freedom. How did Kaiser get people to buy Jeeps? How did they start the Jeep craze? They marketed it as a fun vehicle with a little bit of rebellion and a whole lot of freedom. That's America in a nutshell. A fun country. We're a rebellious country, but we're a country that seeks more freedom, more freedom every day, and we celebrate our freedoms. All right, the whole American dream is that you can start on one path. You can be born here, and if you work hard and if you want it bad enough, you can make it onto a different path. And that's the same spirit that surrounds Jeep. That's why people buy Jeeps. Jeeps get you from A to B, even if there's no road between A to B. You know what I mean? Jeeps are freedom. There's this great line in Pirates of the Caribbean where Jack Sparrow is talking to Elizabeth Swann, and he says, "Sail and rigging and a rudder, that's what a ship needs. But what a ship is freedom." And that's how I feel about Jeep. A steering wheel and a transfer case and a motor and tires, that's what a Jeep needs. But what a Jeep is freedom. All right, that's what you buy when you buy a Jeep. That's what these 7 slats mean to people. It's freedom. You aren't just commuting, all right? You have the ability that if you choose, instead of staying on the road and going to work that day, you can duck off into the woods and disappear, all right? That's what goes through, I know, my mind sometimes when I'm driving to work, you know, and that ability, knowing that you can do more with your vehicle than other people can, is what Jeep owners love, and that's a peace of mind and it's comfort. I know that I have the freedom to go places that most other people can't. Even in a stock Jeep, even in the smallest, you know, Jeep Compass, that's still an option. You can go more places in a Jeep Compass than the person who decided to buy the Prius or the person who decided to buy the Civic, and that's a beautiful thing. And that spirit is the same spirit of why people love the United States. I know that it's a crazy place, all right? Jeep's a crazy brand. We've been all over the map, you know? We've always been owned. We've been shuffled around. We've gone through lean periods. We've gone through fat periods. We've had our image destroyed. But at the end of the day, Jeep survives, right? That's what Lee Iacocca knew. That's why he reached into the smoldering heap that was AMC and pulled out the Jeep brand and saved it for himself and for Chrysler and for the American people and for everyone, because he knew that Jeep endures just like the United States endures. People love the Jeep. People love Jeeps. That's all there is to it. From the first GIs who ever got to drive one during World War II, up to the people who today are clamoring to buy Grand Cherokees. Grand Cherokee is a fascinating vehicle, especially today, because it's one of the only vehicles that can simultaneously steal market shares from every segment of the market. It's stealing away from people who used to buy Hyundai Santa Fe's at the same rate as it's stealing people away who used to drive Land Rovers, all right? People who drive Lexuses are switching to Jeep Grand Cherokees. People who used to drive Mercedes are switching to Jeep Grand Cherokees. Of course, the Wrangler is selling as good as it always does. The Wrangler is the car, all right? That's the car. Everyone wants a Wrangler. Everyone wants to take the doors off and take the top off and just drive on a nice day. Why? Because the less stuff between you and the outside, the more free you feel. Americans want freedom. I don't want to be confined by doors. I don't want to be confined by a roof. I don't even want to be confined by where the road is telling me to go. I want to go anywhere. I want the freedom. And if you buy a Jeep, you get that freedom. And that right there is why Jeep is the most American brand ever, and why you will never catch me saying any other company besides Jeep is #1. That is why I will drive Jeeps until the day I die. That is why I will keep rolling with Jeep, all right? Because I love freedom. I love America. I love Jeep. All right, well, if you were able to stick with me until the end, I appreciate it. I hope it was worth it. I can only imagine how long this video ended up being. Listen, when you're out there in your lifted Jeeps tonight, try to stay safe, all right? Keep them from rolling over, you hear me? I'll see you guys next time.